is in the yellow line. So this is the city of Ann Arbor here in the middle yellow line. The east central area outside Ann Arbor is in the blue line. So this is, so just to come back, right? This is this brown or gray PUMA region here, including Ypsilanti, is in the blue line. And then what we've called the outlying regions of the county, so the west, northeast, and southeast PUMA region is in the green line. Those outlying areas in the green line have typically or have historically had the highest adjusted household incomes in Washtenaw County. And as of 2019, their average household income was approximately $145,000. Household incomes in the city of Ann Arbor, here in the yellow line, have typically tracked a bit lower than in the outlying areas. They jumped sharply in 2019 to almost the same level as the outlying areas. I do want to point out that these numbers are pretty noisy. You can see that they do jump up and down a decent amount. So we're really not sure. If you look at this jump from 2018 to 2019, we really can't say how much of that is simply noise in the data versus a persistent shift that we expect going forward in time. But if you do take those numbers at face value, real household incomes grew by nearly 50% from 2012 to 2019 in Ann Arbor, and by about 30% in the outlying areas. When you look at the eastern central part of the county, you can see that average household incomes are substantially lower than in the other two PUMA regions. They were about $104,000 as of 2019. Just to be clear, that's roughly in line with the state average, but it is behind the rest of the county. And I think the thing that gives us a little more pause is not that level of income is low per se. It is lower than in the other two PUMA areas of Washtenaw County. But like I say, it's in line with the state average. But average household incomes in that east central PUMA region have not seen the same growth as the other areas of the county. Incomes have grown about 22% since 2012. And again, that's roughly in line with the state of Michigan's growth rate, but it's short of the other areas of the county. We also studied the distribution of income in Washtenaw County across race and ethnic groups. And to keep things, to summarize our analysis, this table shows the proportions of Washtenaw County's population that live in households we classified as lower, middle, or upper income households as of 2019. And just to give you a sense of the definitions, we define lower income households as having adjusted incomes less than 2/3 of the national median, and higher income households as having incomes more than twice the national median. For a 3-person household, our definition of the middle class works out to adjusted household incomes between $51,000 and $153,000. For a 1-person household, our definition of the middle class works out to an income between $29,400 and $88,300. So those are kind of the dividing lines, just to give you a sense of the numbers we're showing. And I won't go through all of the numbers in this table because there are a lot of numbers on the table, but hopefully what you can see is that there are important differences between the household income distributions of different racial and ethnic groups in Washtenaw County. Although only roughly 20% of non-Hispanic white and 25% of non-Hispanic Asian Washtenaw County residents live in lower income households, that proportion was 35% for non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic residents of Washtenaw County. By comparison, 39% of non-Hispanic Asian and 35% of non-Hispanic white residents live in higher income households versus 18% of non-Hispanic Black and 21% of Hispanic residents. So I do want to say, look, this analysis does show that there are important disparities in how prosperity is shared within Washtenaw County. That being said, those numbers might be discouraging to you. They certainly point to work to be done to make in terms of making sure that economic prosperity is shared widely throughout Washtenaw County. But those gaps are actually substantially wider in Michigan and the United States overall than they are in Washtenaw County. So I don't want to be overly discouraging. Certainly, Washtenaw County's economy has done a good job of producing prosperity, as I showed you earlier. And like I say, the disparities that exist in Washtenaw County, while they're real, are smaller than exist in Michigan overall and in the nation overall. Okay, so with that, I do want to switch gears to ask, where does Washtenaw County's economy stand right now? The COVID-19 pandemic remains in the driver's seat of the economic recovery. This slide shows the 7-day moving average of new COVID-19 cases in Washtenaw County through early March. If you've been following the numbers, you know that statewide COVID-19 cases have been rising pretty sharply recently. So just in the past few weeks. If you look statewide, the 7-day moving average of new cases is back to where it was in early January, and hospitalization rates have also started to rise again as well. So far, we have avoided that pattern here in Washtenaw County. So just to be clear, these numbers do get revised over time as more cases are detected and confirmed. But as I say, that according to the current data, the trend is still pretty encouraging here in Washtenaw County. We're certainly not epidemiologists, but the situation as we see it, and I think this is a pretty commonly held view, is that we're really in a race right now between new variants of COVID-19 and the rollout of vaccines against the disease. Michigan does have a higher prevalence of the new variants of the virus than nationwide, and those new variants are typically more contagious than the original strain of the virus. And we do believe that's one reason that new cases are rising again statewide. When you look at vaccination rates, statewide, about a quarter of the population has received at least one dose of a vaccine. That proportion is about a third in Washtenaw County. So we're really hoping that the vaccines will turn the tide before cases rise much higher, but we are watching the numbers very closely right now. This slide shows the seasonally adjusted monthly unemployment rates in Michigan and Washtenaw County. I've got Michigan here in blue and Washtenaw County in yellow. And hopefully, you can see pretty well, obviously, that the spike in unemployment that we saw at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Washtenaw County's unemployment rate peaked at 14.7% in April 2020, amid the first wave of the pandemic. As the first wave began to recede and the public health situation improved, employment among Washtenaw County residents recovered briskly in the late spring and summer of 2020. The recovery did slow down last fall amid the second wave of the pandemic. But that being said, by December of 2020, Washtenaw County's unemployment rate had fallen by nearly 10 percentage points to 5%. I do want to point out and just caution people, these are very important numbers. They provide a timely read on what's happening in Michigan and Washtenaw County's economy. But collecting the unemployment data has been very difficult during the pandemic, and these numbers do get revised over time. So I would focus on moving averages or trend movements in the unemployment rate rather than any 1 month's numbers when you're assessing the economic situation right now. This slide compares the proportion of small business locations in Michigan and in Washtenaw County that were closed on any given day relative to the average in January of 2020. And I should say that this data comes from Womply via the Opportunity Insights project. Washtenaw County's small business closure rate stabilized around 24% in September and October of 2020. So if you look, in early fall last year, small business locations, about a quarter of small business locations were closed, I think is the clearest way to say that. And then what you can see is that, as COVID-19 cases started to pick up, and we had the pause to save lives last November, the small business closure rate rose by 6 percentage points in Washtenaw County. And one thing I do want to point out is that if you look closely at the data, the closure rate began to rise prior to the pause to save lives. So it's not just about government restrictions. It's also about people taking precautions because they're being cautious about the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see that as of early February, Washtenaw County's small business closure rate was in the 36 to 37% range, actually, relative to January of last year. So that's in the data that we see. And listen, this data is not official data. It's not an official government statistic. So you do need to interpret it with a little bit of caution. But that being said, more than a third of small businesses in Washtenaw County appear to have been closed as of early February, which is the latest this data extends right now. So that's the situation that we're in the latest data in Washtenaw County. Before Dawn presents our forecast for Washtenaw County's economy looking ahead the next 3 years, I want to summarize what we're expecting for the US economy because that really provides the context for Dawn's presentation. This slide displays our baseline forecast for the level of US real GDP through 2023. Perhaps surprisingly, the pandemic-related turmoil last year led to an annual real GDP decline of only 3.5%, as unprecedented federal fiscal support insulated the economy from a more severe contraction. We expect real GDP to return to its pre-pandemic level by the middle of this year. So essentially by the third quarter of 2021, we expect real GDP to get back to where it was before the pandemic. The outlook that really underlies that forecast is that we do expect the pandemic to continue to subside. And we also expect the $1.9 trillion spending package in the recently passed American Rescue Plan to do a lot to support the economy. Our forecast translates to annual real GDP growth of 4.8% this year, 3.9% next year, and 2.6% in 2023, as the effects of the federal stimulus begin to wear off. I do want to make two additional remarks about our US economic forecast. The first is that there's a significant disconnect between GDP and employment right now, because lower wage workers have been disproportionately likely to lose their jobs relative to higher wage workers. When we look at employment instead of GDP, we don't expect a recovery to pre-pandemic levels until the end of next year. So again, just to be clear, we're expecting real GDP to get back to where it was before the pandemic, roughly by the third quarter this year. In terms of employment, not until the end of next year. Second, I do want to say we completed our most recent US forecast that underlies the graph I'm showing you here in February. Most of the economic news since then has been positive in our judgment. So we actually think, unusually perhaps, the risks to our forecast are actually skewed to the upside right now. We think that there's some chance that we'll get a substantially faster recovery than we forecast, rather than the risks being skewed to the downside in the short term. And usually when we talk about forecast risks, you talk about all of the ways things could go wrong. And there aren't that many ways that things could go better than you've anticipated. So we're in a little bit of an unusual situation this year. We're in a very unusual situation this year because we're still in the middle of a global pandemic, but you take my point economically. This slide shows our forecast for national and Detroit 3 light vehicle sales on an annual basis. Total vehicle sales fell from 17 million units in 2019 to 14.4 million in 2020, with the bulk of that loss occurring in the second quarter last year. We're forecasting light vehicle sales to rebound to 16.5 million units this year, 16.8 million units in 2022, and 17.2 million units in 2023. And although our projected sales pace for light vehicles this year does remain below the pre-pandemic levels, we actually do consider this part of our forecast to lean a bit toward the optimistic side in light of the many uncertainties surrounding the automotive supply chain, such as the ongoing semiconductor shortage. Turning my attention to Detroit 3 light vehicle sales in the blue line, they fell from just under 7 million units in 2019 to 5.9 million units in 2020. As the pandemic subsides and consumers regain their confidence, we are predicting sales to nudge up to 6.6 million units this year, 6.7 million units next year, and 6.8 million units in 2023. That is a decent recovery, but what you can see on the graph is that we are not projecting a full recovery to where we were before the pandemic for Detroit 3 light vehicle sales in our forecast period. Okay, so that's most of what I had to say. Before I turn things over to Alex and then to Dawn for a forecast of Washtenaw County's economic recovery, I will follow our longstanding tradition of reviewing how we did in our forecast last year. Last May, we forecast that the COVID-19 pandemic would cause payroll employment in Washtenaw County to decline by 14,300 payroll jobs in 2020, for a decline of 6.5%. The preliminary data indicates that the county lost 16,200 jobs for a decline of 7.4%. Our forecast of job growth was therefore 0.9 percentage points too high, an underestimate of about 1,900 jobs lost due to the pandemic. That miss was 0.2 percentage points larger than our average absolute forecast error over the past 33 years of 0.7 percentage points. Last year, Washtenaw County's job count contracted the most in a single year that we have on record. So overall, we do think our forecast did a pretty good job of hitting the mark, despite how bad the economic news was, given the tremendous uncertainty and flux in the economy that we were facing last year. And so Don insisted that we do a review of last year's forecast. And I think rightly, just to say, the economy has been very uncertain. It's been an incredible time in terms of what's happened in the economy as an economic forecaster, but we are pleased with how our modeling ended up shaking out last year. We do wish that the news was better. I wish that I was saying we were pleased that we had forecast an economic boom and we got one. Unfortunately, that's not the situation we're in today. Just to talk about the other metrics that we follow, we had forecast an average unemployment rate of 8.4% for 2020, which ended up being about 1.9 percentage points higher than the actual rate of 6.5%. And we had forecast a rate of 0.5% for local price inflation. And we ended up recording price inflation of 1% for the Detroit CPI. So again, just to summarize, overall, we are satisfied with how our forecast performed last year in light of the extremely challenging forecasting environment, but we certainly wish that it had turned out that we were too pessimistic rather than too optimistic. And so we're hoping for better news in the years to come. So with that, I'm finished with my remarks, and my friend Alex West, who is the Director of Research at Ann Arbor Spark, will now take some time for questions and answers.
Thanks, Gabe. As always, a very interesting presentation. I'm taking notes furiously. I know many of our attendees are as well. I have a couple questions from the Q&A. The first is sort of a clarification question on the wide span of middle class income definition. So can you talk a little bit about how that's defined and why you chose those boundaries?
Absolutely. I will say, so, and Don is also on the Q&A. So Don, please jump in anytime you like. We actually did a pretty deep dive in the report that we prepared for SEMCOG, the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, last year, onto various definitions of the middle class. And as far as we can tell, there are as many definitions of the middle class as there are reports about the middle class. We decided not to contribute our own. We actually took an established definition from the Brookings Institution. And in fact, the Brookings has a very nice report where they go into, I think it was like 13 different definitions of the middle class. Don, does that number sound right to you?
Right, and I think the Pew Charitable Trust actually put out a report every year on it, and they use the 2/3 of the median and twice the median as the range. When we were putting together the numbers, that tended to result in about a little more than half of the population falling in the middle class, and a little maybe 30% 33% in the lower income class, or roughly 1/6 of the in the lower middle class, and then about 18% in the higher income group. And those numbers all seemed pretty reasonable. So there was a standard, and then as we looked at the overall numbers, that seemed to fit our perception of what most people would think is how the income is distributed in the country.
Yeah.
So just to thanks Don and thanks Alex. Yeah. So again, as Don said, it's Pew really uses this methodology consistently, and like I say, Brookings kind of did this deep dive into all of these different definitions of the middle class, and I believe the Pew methodology kind of came out close to the top in their estimation. So I agree, though, I was surprised by how wide the dollar range turned out to be.
Right, especially for Washtenaw County, and it also speaks to the gaps as you also outlined. The second question for this session, or there's a couple that sort of touch on gender and the gaps, sort of the she session that's happening. You're welcome to also save this question for the end if you'd like, but just sort of addressing some of the data on women leaving the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to say, Alex, you took the words right out of my mouth. A lot of people have called this a she session. If you think back to the Great Recession, people called it sometimes a man session. And so, this recession has been very unusual historically for many reasons, obviously. One of them is the differential impact on women. So generally, if you look at recessions over US history, they've either affected both men and women equally, or they have typically affected men more than women. So that's the historical pattern. Certainly in the Great Recession, that was the case. It was a so-called man session, that men were affected much more than women. So far in the pandemic recession, women do seem to have been affected more than men. There are different ways of cutting the data, and they can give you somewhat different results depending how you stare at the graphs. But by and large, I think most people will agree that women have been more affected than men in the recession. So just to give you a rough sense, women's unemployment rose by about 2.8 percentage points more than men's at the beginning of the pandemic. And again, like I say, that's unusual historically. When you look at the labor force participation rate, men's and women's labor force participation has declined. We've only seen partial recoveries in both of them. One thing that makes it challenging to interpret that data is that there is a different seasonality in men's and women's labor force participation. But just to talk about, well, what is driving these gaps? I think the first thing to be upfront about is nobody knows for certain right now, what exactly is responsible for these gaps. One thing to say, there are two kind of obvious culprits that we do think play an important role are different industry mixes. So women have been more likely to work in industries that have been harder hit by the pandemic than men. And then also childcare duties. So, we know that many children are out of school. So if you have school-age children, the pandemic has really put an additional burden on you in terms of childcare. We certainly see that, in my house. And, the reality is we still live in a very gendered world economically. And so that burden of caring for children really has fallen more on women, we believe, than on men. And I think the data really speaks to that. So I think that's a big part of it. And then Alex, there also seems to be a trend that men typically have greater ability to telework than women. So I think that's also part of it. And just one last thing to say, it turns out that this is an international phenomenon. It's not just an American phenomenon that it's been a she session. It's really been a she session in most countries as far as we can tell.
I will add here that the Michigan Bureau of Labor Market Information released their Women in the Michigan Workforce Report today. So I'll post a link to that in the chat so everyone can view it. There's a couple just clarification questions. When you talked about closed businesses, was that businesses that were permanently closed or temporarily closed or not sure?
That's a great question. Yeah, let me come back to that. So again, I think this data, you've got to be careful in interpreting it. Like I say, it's not a government statistical release. There's not a long history where you can do a lot to account for seasonality and things like that. It's clearly noisy. Just to be clear about what it is it's payment processor data. So it's card processor data. And basically, if there are no card swipes or payment records at a business in a day, they say that business was closed relative to January of 2020. So we don't have a sense of are these permanent closures or not from this data. So it's just, was your business open on this day? Did you receive and process payments is the way to interpret this data.
Okay. And then we have a question that is a little bit longer. So we have a couple minutes left. So considering the pandemic negatively impacted smaller businesses and lower wage workers at a higher rate, how does that correlate to our economy? So how are the results different than if there had been a more broadly spread impact?
Well, I think there are a few different ways to think about this question. First off, it has been an unequal recession. We talked about the she-cession. You hear about the K-shaped recovery. Although I think Don objects to the phrase K-shaped recovery, and I'll let him talk about that if he wants. But the just to give people a sense of what that means is, listen, higher wage workers have by and large fared substantially better in this recession. They've been, much less likely to lose their jobs. And a big part of that is a greater ability to telework. So I'm at home right now, and I think all of us are at home, doing our jobs. If you work in a mom and pop shop, if you work in a restaurant, in a hotel, you can't really do that remotely, right? And so we do see this K-shaped recovery, or this, an unequal impact of this recession across income groups. You do also see it in terms of small business versus large business to some extent. And, one thing is, small businesses have a harder time accessing capital markets than larger businesses to kind of stay afloat. And also, you see a lot of small businesses in hard hit sectors such as leisure and hospitality. So, this recession and the pandemic really have had very unequal impacts across different industries in the economy. And we're expecting that to continue for some time, where we really see a two-track recovery in some sense, where businesses and industries that feature a lot of in-person interaction as an essential part of the business are going to lag behind in the recovery. Industries where that's not an essential part of the business. And small businesses are overrepresented in those industries.
Just a couple observations. Because the higher wage workers have fared so much better, and because essentially there has been this enormous accumulation of savings, because people literally couldn't spend the money they were making, and because of the government, particularly the federal government, has responded so quickly and so massively in terms of providing income support. There obviously are people who fell through the cracks, but in terms of a policy response, the federal policy response last year was surprisingly good, strong, and fast. So we're actually set up now much better than we normally are coming out of a recession. And I think that's really important to understand. We have not had the enormous damage to wealth, house values, for example, that we had during the Great Recession. The tax revenue has held up remarkably well in most communities, because higher wage and higher income households have maintained their income, and they're still paying a lot of tax revenue. So we're actually set up pretty well for the recovery going forward for most people. Again, for less educated workers, as we'll see, people who are working in the hospitality industry, small businesses they've taken a much bigger hit and are clearly in trouble going forward. And it's a very disparate impact, and the recovery is also disparate, but because of who has not been hurt as badly or tend to be higher income, it actually creates more stability and resilience than in earlier recessions.
Thank you both. And it's a great segue. I'm going to turn it now over to Don to talk about the Washtenaw outlook.
I figured I might as well jump in there, and that way I could turn the mute off before I'm supposed to be saying anything. 2019 and the recovery between 2010 and 2019 were really good in Michigan and Washtenaw County, and you look at all the data that Gabe showed, and things were doing quite well in the county. There was a problem with the distribution of those gains to some extent, but in aggregate, things were doing well. Then we got the COVID recession, and now this is the unemployment rate, and this data is quarterly. The data Gabe showed you previously was monthly, but we forecast the results quarterly, not annually. But the graph looks very similar to what Gabe showed you. And what actually is I think struck me when I was looking at this is if you look at the yellow line, which is Washtenaw County, you actually see that during the second quarter of the Great Recession, in Washtenaw County, the unemployment rate was as high as it was in the state of Michigan during the Great Recession. That the yellow line peaked at about the same level as during the entire state. That sort of shows you how severe effect it was. The Washtenaw County, which normally runs, much lower unemployment rate, got up to the highest level in the state in 2009. But then it fell sharply in the second quarter, sort of flattened out at the end of the year and in the first quarter of 21, but then begins to resume its decline, both in the state and in the county. And so by the end of our forecast, which is at the end of 2023, you will see that the unemployment rate in the state of Michigan is expected to be exactly the same as it was at the end of 2019, 3.9%. And the unemployment rate in Washtenaw County, which I believe comes in at about 2.5%, is actually a 1/10 of a percentage point less than it was at the end of 2019. Now, 1/10 of a percentage point is a meaningless statistic in economics, especially when looking at a county. But so essentially what you need to just say is that in terms of the unemployment rate, we are expecting to get a full recovery in both the state of Michigan and the Washtenaw County by the end of 2023. So a very good recovery, and we get back to where we were in a couple more years. So that's pretty good. Next slide. So what we've done here is we've looked at how the county and the state are expected to grow in terms of jobs over the next 3 years. We have indexed these values so that the first quarter of 2020 is equal to 100. So we can compare areas of different size. And what you see, of course, is that the job loss in the second quarter in the state of Michigan was about 19%. That's the blue line that dives down to a reading of about 81. And in this county, the job loss was about 15%, so that the yellow line dives down to a reading of about 85. We then recover jobs pretty sharply in the third quarter, getting back a little less than half the jobs we lost in both the county and the state, and in just one quarter, which was pretty good. And then the recovery flattens out in the fourth quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 21. But then in the case of both the state and the county, we expect job gains to resume in the second quarter and to continue through the end of 2023. You notice that in the yellow line crosses the 100 value in the second quarter of 2023. That's when in terms of employment, the county gets back to its first quarter 2020 numbers, and that by the end of 23, employment in a county is almost 2 percentage points higher than it was at its previous peak in the first quarter of 2020. The state at the end of 23 is still slightly less in terms of employment, about 0.3 of a percentage points less than it had reached in the first quarter of 2020. The reason that the county's unemployment rate only gets back to the same level at its previous peak into 2019, beginning of 2020, but jobs are higher at the end of 23 is because we get labor force growth in the county. County's labor force is expected to grow. On the other hand, we actually don't see any labor force growth in the state between the end of first quarter of 2020 and the end of 23. And again, that'll track a lot of the population and the age composition of the different geographies. But there's also a variance in labor force growth. Go to the next slide, Gabe, if you would. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the industry detail. There's an appendix in the paper that will be published both at WCC website and our own RSQE website later today. And the appendix has information on 111 industries, but now we're just going to talk about some of the major industries to sort of summarize what's going on. So Gabe, if you slip, okay. And here you can sort of see the payroll job recovery in total in the county that we're forecasting for the next 3 years. This year, we're expecting the county to add about 4,266 jobs for a growth of 2.1%. We actually see the change in the number of jobs to increase by 4.8% in 2022 as an acceleration in job growth, but that's partly the result of when we expect the timing of the job gains, because we're looking at the change in annual averages here. And since most of the job gains are going to occur in the second half of 2021, that actually is going to actually push up the annual average numbers in 2022. So it's a bit of a statistical artifact in the growth, but the annual average change is going to be larger next year than, substantially larger next year than this year, and then slip back a little bit to 2.3% in 23. Overall, as you can see in the column entitled the change from 2020 to 23, you can see that that number, 19,056, is substantially larger than the number of jobs lost in calendar year 2020 of 16,207. So that the Washtenaw County on an annual average basis in 2023 is expected to have about 2,800 more jobs than it did in 2019. The private sector follows a very similar pattern in terms of employment growth, but if you notice, the government sector is actually forecast to lose jobs in 2021 before then rebounding strongly in 2022 and 2023, so that the government sector ends up about 1,700 jobs higher than in 2019 levels of employment. Virtually all of those job gains are in state government, as you see in the last line of this graph, and that clearly reflects the resilience of the University of Michigan, and especially Michigan Medicine, the healthcare provider that's associated with the university. We then take a look at the next slide. We will show you, we sort of divided jobs into several categories. And this first slide shows you 4 industries that actually gained jobs in 2020. The increase, if you look at the column that's titled 2019 to 2020, were generally pretty small, but it's actually pretty remarkable that there were industries in Washtenaw County that actually added jobs last year. The other thing that's probably most remarkable about these industries, if you look over at the far right column, is the average wages. The first 3 industries you see there, management of companies, utilities, and information, are the 3 highest paying major industries in Washtenaw County. So the 3 highest paying industries in the county all added jobs in 2020. And the transportation and warehousing, the average wage is actually slightly higher than the overall average. So that's an above average industry as well in terms of pay rates. And again, it gained jobs in 2020. Now, utilities and information are not expected to add very many jobs over the next 3 years. Management of companies, it's a small number, but we expect it to grow by about 12 percentage points, adding 169 jobs. The transportation and warehousing industry adds more substantial number of jobs over the next 3 years, 709, and that's a gain of about 18%. So a very fast growth in transportation and warehousing. That's mostly because of the warehouse industry. Next slide. Now, we next have divided 8 industries which have recovered all of the jobs they lose in 2019 into 2 categories. First are 4 industries where the industry pays above average wages. And then we'll show you in a second 4 industries that have lower paying jobs. But again, what you notice here is that the top of the list, which is professional and technical services, we expect to add 1,800 jobs over the next 3 years, a gain of over 10%. And again, that's the 4th highest paying industry. Finance and insurance, we don't expect it to gain very many jobs over the next 3 years, 79, but it's again another high paying industry. And then wholesale trade, growth of about 8%. And then if you notice the last line is the construction industry, lost relatively few jobs in 2020 compared to what normally happens during a recession. We're expecting it to add over 1,000 jobs over the next 3 years, and gaining about 22% in employment. This is an industry where we may be too optimistic, but not because of a demand. We think there'll be a lot of demand for construction activity in the county, but because of supply of workers, we're really concerned about the availability of workers in the construction industry over the next 3 years and overall. And then next we go to the next slide, which shows full recovery industries that we classify as having lower paying jobs. These are industries that are actually have pay that is below the average for all industries in the county. Although if you actually look at the private health and social services industry and real estate and rental industry, you'll see that their pay is actually in the 50,000 range. So it's really, they're not lower paying industries overall, they're just below average. On the other hand, natural resources and mining and arts and recreation are both relatively low paying industries. Natural resource mining is very small, but arts and recreation, we expect to add 1,200 jobs over the next 3 years, and it is one of the lowest paying industries in a county with average pay of $23,000 in 2019, and a job growth that's a pretty significant gain over 2020. And we go to the next slide. These are the industries 7 industries where we do not think employment by 2023 will return to 2019 levels. So these are the industries that do not enjoy a complete recovery. What you notice is that the first 5 industries that are listed in this graph, in this table, are all relatively low paying industries. And the 2 categories at the bottom are our 2 major manufacturing sectors, transportation equipment, better known as the auto industry. We don't expect it to recover 2019 employment in a county. And also then the rest of manufacturing, again, we don't expect it to recover employment gains either. The accommodation, part of the reason that some of these industries, particularly accommodation and food services, don't get back to 2019 levels is the severity of the job loss in 2020, 4,461 jobs. We actually are expecting pretty good job gains over the next 3 years, 3,300 jobs. But because of the job loss in 2020, we don't get back to 2019 levels. So it's not a K-shaped recovery in the sense that these incomplete recovery industries are losing jobs. They're actually gaining jobs, and actually gaining jobs at a pretty good clip in most cases. But the problem is that the decline in 2020 in these industries was so severe that they cannot recover enough jobs by 2023 with any reasonable level of growth to get back to 2019 levels. Although a couple of these industries, retail trade, for example, if you look at those numbers, losing 1,657 jobs and regaining only 639, we don't think retail trade will ever return to 2019 employment levels. And that's also true of the 2 manufacturing industries, auto manufacturing and the rest of manufacturing industries as a group. We don't expect that they'll ever return to 2019 employment levels in the county. There may be some subcategories that do, but not the major categories. Turn to the next slide. There's a table in the full report that lists 15 of the industries that had the greatest job gains in 2015 to 2019 period, and then are also forecast to have the greatest job gains in the 2021 to 2023. I'm not going to go over that now. We just want to point out that the industries that gain the most jobs from 2015 to 19 are generally forecast to gain the most jobs between 21 to 23 as well. So that we expect that the pattern of job creation over the next 3 years will look a lot like it did before the pandemic. So job creation in very similar industries over the next 3 years. Next slide. As Gabe described, we forecast inflation in the county which is actually the Detroit CPI. Inflation is not actually measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the county level, but they do have a measure for the Detroit region, which includes Washtenaw County. And so what you see here in the yellow line is the United States CPI, and the Detroit CPI is in the blue line. And we expect inflation to pick up in 21 to about 2.4% in both the county or the Detroit region and the nation. And then that inflation will slip back a little bit to a little over 2% in 22 before rebounding to about 2.4% again in 23. Inflation is running a little bit slower in the Detroit region than in the nation. Next slide, please. In this slide, we have graphed the average real wage in the state of Michigan, which is in the blue line, and in Washtenaw County, which is in the yellow line. And this is in real dollars, and runs from 2019 to 2001 through 2023. You can look at this and sort of see why everybody was concerned about the wage decline, wage flatness, however you want to describe it. And it was certainly true through about 2024. So we had about a decade or more, maybe 12 years, where wages didn't go anywhere in either the county or the state. As the economy picked up after 2014, economy unemployment rate fell both in the nation and the county. Real wages grew pretty good between 2014 and 2019 in both the county and the state. And then what you'll see is this enormous spike in both the county and the state in 2020. I believe the numbers are about 5% of an increase in the state and about a 6% increase in the real wage in the county in 2020. Now, this is going to surprise a lot of people. I mean, that's the middle of a pandemic. Why are average wages going up so sharply? And the reason for that is because predominantly because of the change in industry mix. It was lower wage jobs that were lost, higher wage jobs stuck around. And as we saw, in some cases, actually, higher wage industries actually grew in terms of employment. And mathematically, what happens is that when you shrink the number of jobs that are lower paying and increase or don't shrink very much the number of jobs that are high in paying, that sends the average up. And that's just a mathematical result of the changing composition of jobs in the county and in the state. Ironically, as the recovery gets going in 21 and 22, and we bring back lower paying jobs, the mix of jobs changes in favor of lower paying jobs, and that brings down the average wage in both the county and the state. And then in 23, average wages increase in both places a little bit. So you sort of have to ignore sort of those the spike in 2020 and then the decline. It's sort of confusing to look at, but if you look at the trend between 2019 and 2023, you see that the wage growth is, I believe it's about 3% in Washtenaw County and about 2% in the state of Michigan in terms of real wage growth in total over that period. So we are going to get real wage growth, but the timing of when it occurs is going to be a bit odd. If you go to the next slide, Gabe. We then divide the economy into three major industry groups. The first group, which we show in the yellow line, is the average wage in blue collar industries. Now, if you read the report, you can see what industries we allocate to each category. But blue collar industries are generally your manufacturing industries, your construction industries, some of your natural resource industries like mining, and also the transportation and warehousing industries. Just to give you a brief summary of that industry group, which is pretty easy to understand. Then we have higher education attainment service industries in the blue line. Those are industries which mostly employ highly educated people with a bachelor's degree or more education. And then what we call lower education services industries in the green line. And those are industries which tend to employ people with less education attainment. And what you see here is that historically, up through about 2012, 2011, blue collar industries in the county paid more than even the higher education attainment services industries. That was in the heyday of the high wages being paid in the auto industry in particular. But as that industry had to undergo the Great Recession and the aftermath of the Great Recession, blue collar wages took a big hit, whereas higher education service industries continued to increase throughout that period, and that starting in 2012 began to exceed blue collar industry wages, and that continues both through the current period 2020 and also into the forecast period. You'll also notice that the lower education attainment service industries, two things. First, wages are very low. They tend to pay only about half as much as either the blue collar or the higher education attainment service industries. And you see that if there's any trend in this picture, certainly through 2014, it was a decline in the wages in the lower education attainment industries. Even by 2020, we don't expect them to be much higher than they were in their prior peak of 2022. If you look at the going out for the next 3 years, the fastest wage gains between 2019 and 2023 are in the higher education attainment service industries. The second at about 3.5%. The second biggest wage gains are in the blue collar industries. They come in at about 2.7%, I believe, in terms of total wage growth between 2019 and 2023. And the lowest wage gains are in the lower education attainment service industries, which grow by about 2% from 2019 to 2023. Next slide, please. And here what we do is we look at the jobs that are in each of these industry groups. And this is probably one of the most important and informative slides in this presentation. What you see here is that in the 2020 recession, that the number of jobs in these higher education attainment services industries declined by about 3 percentage points, which is a pretty small decline. The number of jobs in the blue collar industries declined by 12%, and the number of jobs in lower education attainment services industries declined by about 15 percentage points. That's the line that's with a value of about 85. That means it declined by about 15 percentage points. That's an incredibly unusual situation. Normally, you will see the green line in a normal recession at the top, the yellow line, the blue collar industry suffering the greatest job loss, and actually even the high education and service industries, because many of them, particularly in Michigan and Washtenaw County, tend to be tied to the auto industry and manufacturing sector, actually suffering more than the lower education attainment industries. Not by much, but usually it declines a little bit more. So this is 2020 was extraordinarily unusual. Then you see what our forecast going forward, and if you look at the blue line, you see that by 2022, the number of jobs in higher education attainment service industries exceeds the level in 2019. And by the end of our forecast in 2023, the number of jobs is almost 4 percentage points higher than it was in 2019. Blue collar industries see rapid employment gains through 2023, edging just above the level in 2019. But I must caution, all of these job gains are in the construction industry and in transportation and warehousing. The manufacturing sector does regain jobs, but it does not recover anywhere near the levels, anywhere near the 2019 levels. So that the huge job gains in blue collar industries really reflects construction and transportation and warehousing. You can also see relatively rapid growth in the green line in the lower education attainment service industries, but these job gains continue to leave employment in lower education attainment service industries about 3.5 percentage points below 2019 levels by the end of our forecast period in 2023. So, you know, the summary here is that if you look at the sort of long run picture in the county, and this is certainly true in everything we've looked at in the state of Michigan and elsewhere, is that the higher education attainment service industries are going to plow through this recession and end up much better off than where they were in 2019 in terms of number of jobs. The blue collar industries will do pretty well, getting back to the 2019 levels as a group, but with a change in mix really towards the construction industry and transportation and warehousing. And that the industry group that suffers fewer jobs, that has fewer jobs in 2023 that they did in 2019, is the lower education attainment service industries, which this means that the job opportunities for people with less education in Washtenaw County and elsewhere in the state is really a problem. And I think that goes back to you know, the shared prosperity figure that Gabe introduced the talk with, that, you know, in 2019 we had a problem with the distribution of prosperity across racial groups and across geographic areas in the county. And I think that that disparity in 2023, at least if our forecast is accurate, will actually even be worse when we finally get that data, because the job growth is not going to come through nearly as strongly for people with less education as for the other education groups. And if you go back one more slide, don't go back there, but you can remember that I told you that it was only going to be a 2% wage growth in the lower education attainment services industry. So again, they're going to suffer more in terms of wage growth, but mostly in terms of job growth. And so the problem that we saw in terms of shared prosperity in 2019, at least if our forecast is accurate, looks like it's going to get worse, continue to get worse as we go forward. And that's something that policymakers will have to deal with. And since we're at the community college, you know, Professor Belanca, President Belanca, you guys are probably the best situated in terms of raising the educational attainment of some of the people who don't have have a high school degree or have started college but never completed it, need to be trained to get into these construction jobs, need to be more successful. And I think that your role in the community in terms of trying to alleviate some of this disparity issues cannot be overstated. And so I wish you a lot of luck. You've got a challenging and important job ahead of you. And that's my comments.
Thank you so much, Don. We have a few questions in the Q&A, and it's actually a great segue because you were just talking about some of the disparities in the lower education attainment service areas. So as economists, I know you are often asked to give you know, thoughts or recommendations on policy, but it's tough to do as an economist. So maybe I'll ask sort of, you know, this is a question about the disparity in, you know, there are lots of jobs that pay substantially below the average county wage, making it challenging for our local cost of living. So maybe we can tie it back to, there were some earlier questions about the proposed raising of the minimum wage. Are there, you know, any thoughts around that?
Just one thing, since I was the one who praised the pandemic relief by the federal government last year and this year, there was one thing they left out, and that is a lot of money for retraining workers. And that is a real shortfall, given that we see you know, such a wide disparity in employment gains across industries, and I'm sure that is also going to turn out to be the case in terms of occupation. So to the extent that we have any people in the audience who have any clout with the federal legislators, they need to step up to the plate in terms of retraining funds, because that's actually probably the most, and remember, we're not going to get any labor force growth. So we're going to need to make sure that we can't leave people out of the labor force, and that everybody is able to, we're going to need them in these construction jobs, in these warehouse jobs, in all sorts of other jobs. So there are going to be job opportunities, but that we're going to have to convert people who were working in industries that are not recovering the jobs into these new occupations. So that was my one policy thing, since you introduced it that way. Before we get to the minimum wage, which I'll leave to Gabe.
Well, thanks, Don, and thanks, Alex. Well, the minimum wage, it's hard to win as an economist when you're asked to comment on the minimum wage, because the answers are never satisfactory to everyone. One thing that I do want to say that I believe strongly is that a strong labor market is one of the best things we can do for lower wage and marginal workers. So it's not just about wages, it's also about employment. One thing to say is the employment and unemployment and labor force prospects of less educated workers and other disadvantaged groups is much more cyclically sensitive. So and you do see some of that in this recession also. Obviously, we've talked about the K-shaped recovery and teleworking, but that is a broader pattern. So we talked about ways in which this recession is different. There are also ways in which this recession has fit the historical trend, and one just historical regularity is that a strong, tight labor market does benefit those at the bottom. It takes a long time, and it's really a shame. We were starting, when you look at the 2019 economy, wages, at the lower end of the income distribution were rising faster, finally, than at the upper end when you look at incomes. And a hot labor market is great in terms of bringing in disadvantaged workers into the workforce and bringing them into employment. Whereas a weak labor market, those people really do get hit the hardest. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. When you look at the minimum wage, I spent time at CBO, so I always go to CBO as kind of my baseline way to understand the impacts of the minimum wage. And I certainly don't have the expertise to comment more than the analysis that I've seen there that has always struck me as pretty reasonable, which is a higher minimum wage, within the realm of historical experience, probably would lead to some modest employment losses at the same time that it would increase wages at the low end of the income of the wage distribution. We typically, to get into the weeds, so the first thing to say is we do believe the labor demand curve slopes down, and that's why you do typically economic analysis would suggest some job loss from a higher minimum wage. Although there are theories, when you get into monopsonistic theories of the labor market, there are theories that say maybe you wouldn't have job losses, and a lot depends on various circumstances. CBO's estimation is there would be modest job losses from a higher minimum wage, but that what we would call the elasticity of labor demand is small enough that overall aggregate income going to affected workers would rise. So the rise in wages from an increase in the minimum wage would outweigh the job loss in terms of aggregate low wage income. I have no reason to doubt that analysis or to second guess. At any economic analysis, there's always reasons to doubt it. Let me step back and say, but I personally, believe that that's a very reasonable analysis of the effects of an increase in the minimum wage.
Thank you both. I know this is minimum wage is always an iffy subject to get into. There's a question in the Q&A that is slightly different from the report, but it is interesting in terms of the legalization of marijuana. Do you have a lens on how this budding industry fits into the forecast at all?
Don, I'll let you take that one. You gave me the minimum wage.
It's generally would be considered a small industry. So you probably have small businesses that are involved in retail sales of marijuana. It's also a heavily taxed industry, so it does pretty good in terms of generating tax revenue. I guess over the longer term, I can't address any of the socioeconomic fallout, but I do think that the different government units throughout Michigan are going to be needing to find new revenue sources going forward. And a lot of that is related to the aging the population and the demographics and a whole host of problems that we face in terms of traditional revenue sources for state and local government. So, sports betting, internet gaming, marijuana, all of those things, while they may not generate nearly as much revenue as sales or income tax or property taxes, may provide a significant boost in tax revenue as people choose to engage in that activity.
Excellent. And then a final question, we talked about the SHE session at a sort of national or more wider state level. Do we have any data at a county level that sort of breaks down industry and jobs by gender? I don't know how, I haven't been able to come across anything that is that detailed.
Alex, I think we would probably need to wait for the American Community Survey data, which is, doesn't, it wouldn't be exactly, I think, what we would all hope for. And it's also not out yet.
Right.
So
well, the other, it's one of the problems that we run into with when people are asked the question of what industry do they work in, frequently they'll actually classify themselves in a different industry than the government does. For example, there's an industry called corporate headquarters, which we mentioned as one of the industries that is growing. The government has that classification, but nobody says I work at corporate headquarters. They all will say I work at the corporate headquarters that's in the auto industry. And then you have a problem with people who are working in the temporary help industry. When they are surveyed and asked what industry they work in, they tell them the place where they're working at that particular point in time. I'm working for, the Kellogg company or
right.
whoever they happen to be working for in whatever industry that is. But again, the government would classify them as working in the temporary help industry. So there's a problem that when people are trying to self-identify what industry they work in as opposed to the government, an inconsistency there.
Yeah. Well, I know we are out of time for Q&A. I want to thank all of the attendees who submitted questions. They were all wonderful questions. And I want to thank Gabe and Dawn for your intelligent and thoughtful responses. And I will turn it back over to Dr. Belanca to conclude the meeting.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex. And as expected, it was a very informative presentation and engaging discussion. I know there's been a lot of information shared today, so I wanted to note that each of you will receive an email with a link to the recording of this event, as well as the ability to download the full report. One of the things that was mentioned by Don, and Don, I want to thank you. You're the best advocate for community colleges. And I appreciate everything that you say. And one of the things that you mentioned today was the importance of the community college in helping individuals to reskill or to even attain some sort of certificate or degree. There is a program right now called the Reconnect program. And what it is, it's actually a tuition-free program that is available to any Michigan resident that's at least 25 years old when they apply. That if they lived in Michigan for a year or more, they have a high school diploma, but yet they have not yet completed a college degree. So it's for that student that is looking for that community college degree. So, or the training as you're related to. So I would encourage anyone that knows anyone that is interested in that program to really take a look at our website and find out more information about this program. We are having two sessions, information sessions, One is Wednesday, March 31st. We've had others, but these are the ones coming up. Wednesday, March 31st from 5:30 to 6:30. And the other is on Thursday, April 1st from 11 o'clock to 12. So please take a look at our website and share this information with others that may be interested. Again, I'd like to thank Gabe. Gabe, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to see you. And Don, again, a pleasure. And Alex for being such a great facilitator and being here today to offer your unique insights and perspectives. And also I'd like to thank our event sponsors, Ann Arbor Spark, Washtenaw County, and Washtenaw Community College for their support. Before you leave, be sure to check your calendars for our next presentation, the Washtenaw Economic Club's next presentation, which is on Tuesday, May 11th. The topic of that session will be the future of mobility, and it will feature Trevor Paul, who's the Chief Mobility Officer for the state of Michigan, Michelle Krebs, the Director of Automotive Relations at autotrader.com, and Al Leeds, who's the Director of Advanced Transportation here at Washtenaw Community College. Finally, you'll be prompted to take a short survey about today's presentation momentarily. Your feedback is so important to us because it informs us about future programming. So please take a minute to complete it. And again, I sincerely want to thank all of you. I want to tell you how much we appreciate you, how much I miss seeing you, and how much I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your